Welcome, everyone. This webinar is the third in a series on the use of technology in VAW counseling. As a reminder, our first webinar covered how to choose platforms for online counseling, and the second webinar was on ethics and safety. You can find these webinar recordings on WomenAct's website, where the previous two recordings are located. Today, our third webinar will be on techniques and tips for online counseling with individuals, groups, and children and youth. We have 5 amazing presenters, and there will be a short time for questions and answers at the end of the 3 presentations. Our first speaker will be discussing her experience of transitioning from counseling by phone to virtual counseling. Luciana is a counselor at the Abrigo Center and a registered psychotherapist in Ontario. She's passionate about providing counseling to support and empower women who have suffered intimate partner abuse. Luciana.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thanks, Joanne, for having me here. Alisa, can you please move to the next slide? Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to invite you all to take a deep breath, because I only have 10 minutes to share with you my personal experience of providing online counseling to women that are exposed to domestic violence. Next slide, please. I believe we would all agree that changes take time, right? It's a process. It does take time. Next, please. However, we didn't have time to go through all those changes. I believe you all remind it was March 13th when we became aware about the school's closure, and suddenly all the grocery stores were empty. And at Abrigo, we literally had 2 days to shift from the in-person services to the virtual environment. Next, please. Of course, we also had our own personal struggles, right? Working from home, the expectation was not quite the reality for a lot of us. In my case, for example, I didn't have an office available. I was working in my bedroom. I didn't have room for a desk. I was working on my dressing table. My kids were sharing a bedroom, attending virtual school, and my husband was in the living room. So the internet was not as powerful as we needed. So we did have a lot of challenges at the beginning. Next, please. And I also would add that I was very skeptical about the virtual counseling. And I would add that at Abrigo, we offer a culturally sensitive counseling. A lot of my clients, they are from a Portuguese background. And please don't be judgmental, but my clients, they do kiss me and they hug me when they say hi and goodbye. And even like if a client is crying, or even in our culture, if someone is crying, it's impossible to not offer a hug or to have some physical, connection. So for me, like looking at someone through a screen was so cold. It would be impossible to build a strong rapport. That were my thoughts before the pandemic. Next, please. So we were moving from, I would say that regarding counseling services, from 100% in-person services to phone. As I said, in 2 days, for the first time in 30 years in our organization, we suddenly became virtual. We had to access our system from home, and suddenly we only had the phone to connect with our clients. So for the first months of the pandemic, that was all that we had until we got approved to start providing counseling using Zoom. And then we also shifted to the Microsoft Teams. In nowadays, I would say that 60% of my caseload is having counseling services through Microsoft Teams. Next, please. Of course, safety was the main concern at the beginning, but I'm not going to spend time on this slide because I know that it was pretty well covered in the last workshop. So please, next. Thank you. So at the beginning, when we only had the phone to connect with our clients, I would say that at the end of the day, my colleagues and I, we were exhausted. We were so drained. We were lacking the visual clues, because when we are with a client in our office, it's not just about what the client says, right? We have the body language, we have the facial expressions, or even the crying. So there was a lot that we were missing, only having that voice coming from the phone. And also, like, crying. I don't know if you noticed, but some folks can be really quiet when they are crying. And when we are on the phone, we don't even realize if the client's crying or if we got disconnected or, what's going on. The silence, for example, for me was almost like a trigger for my own anxiety, because I couldn't tell if we got cut off or if the client was just taking some time to process. I was also lacking the visual tools. Usually, when I'm having the client in my office, I am drawing, I am writing notes, I'm sharing my notes, I have handouts, illustrations, and by phone, I didn't have all those tools available. Next, please. So when we were finally approved, like to use the virtual setting to provide counseling, for me, it was a blast. Suddenly I was giving a face, sorry, to that voice that I've been listening for a couple months. But of course, we also had challenges. At the beginning, the online setting requested new skills, right? Not just from my client, but also from ourselves. So we were all struggling, learning how to mute, unmute ourselves, how to share videos, how to connect. We were dealing with internet connection as well. So sometimes I would have the client frozen for the whole session, or I would be frozen, right? So there was a lot of frustration, but it was also interesting how we were like first supporting ourselves as counselors, managing our own frustration, and then we were actually able to normalize our clients' frustration with this new reality, the new normal, right? So we were also modeling frustration tolerance with our clients after dealing with our own struggles. Some clients, they needed a lot of coaching, and I would spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes, like at least for one session or two sessions, just guiding them by phone, how to download the app, or even how to learn to mute, unmute, turn on the camera. So there was a lot of, work on that. As I said, safety was another thing that we had to be very careful about. Next, please. And there were barriers, of course, to a client's participation. We had, for example, clients that didn't have an email account or didn't have access to internet at home or even devices to connect. With our seniors group, for example, we had such a nice teamwork. We had a lot of peer support. We had family members also helping them to connect and to able, just to engage in the virtual groups. Next, please. At the same time that I was talking about barriers, I also realized that we were removing a lot of barriers to access services. I had clients, for example, that they would, in the past, before the pandemic, not being able to be in my office because they couldn't take time off from work, because they were supposed to pick up the kids from the school. And suddenly, because we were connecting virtually, the kids were playing the next room and they were there with me. Or some women, they were working, they were cleaning houses, and they were talking to me. So I also realized that those women that in the past, they wouldn't have time to connect to a counselor because we were doing it remotely, they actually were able to seek help. We did develop a lot of strategies, for example, checking in over the session, because as I said, I was not having some close. So like just giving the client the chance of saying, I need a break, this is too much, or can you please stop, or can you please, give me some time. So I was also giving a more active role to my client over the counseling session and empowering the client also to set the tone and to set the pace of our conversation. When we only had the phones, emails became very important because I was sharing the handouts, the complementary material. But when we had the virtual platforms, it was amazing. Suddenly we were sharing screens. We were like doing a guided meditation using some videos. So I added a lot of tools to my counseling session. And I also learned that with the trainings we attended, that the phone and virtual counseling, they can be as just effective as the in-person. And sometimes they can be even more effective when we are dealing with victims of like violence and people that were exposed to trauma. So for the skepticism, I think that was very helpful to me. And I would say that for me, it was a way as well of developing new skills as a professional. And finally, I would say that we were able to build a very strong rapport. I saw clients very thankful for still having a way of connecting with a counselor, despite of places shutting down or not having a place to go. So it did happen. Next, please. So I would just finish saying that change is hard at the beginning, messy in the middle, but can be gorgeous at the end. Through this process, as I said, we as counselors, we also needed to support ourselves and to be very compassionate about our own challenges, having our coworkers support, or even discussing our barriers and struggles in our meetings, having assistance from our supervisors and trainings definitely made a difference in this process. Last slide, please. And this is my new coworker, since I'm working from home. And I invited him just to be here with us, like just thanking you for listening. And if you have questions, please just feel free. Thank you very much for your time.
Luciana, thank you so much. You've packed in so much information in a really short time, and I know that I asked you to do that, and that was probably a Herculean task, but you rose to the challenge, so thank you.
You are welcome.
If you have questions, please put them into the chat box, and we'll get to them for the question and answer period. Our second speakers are going to discuss considerations and techniques of group counseling in the online environment. Claire is a violence against women counselor at Family Service Toronto, providing support through individual and group sessions. She uses an integration approach to working with trauma, drawing on somatic and mindful-based approaches to assist clients to establish safety and improve their well-being. Karen is the manager of violence against women and seniors and caregivers support programs at Family Service Toronto. She's passionate about trauma-informed programs and has experience providing individual and group sessions to adults, children, and families. I'll pass it over to Claire and Karen.
Thank you. So I'm going to get started just speaking a little bit about webinars for service provision, and then Karen is going to talk more about groups. So I've been running a couple webinars at Family Service Toronto. Perhaps you can go to the next slide. So the two webinars I've been offering is a guided meditation webinar, and then as well a trauma-informed yoga webinar. And so webinar meaning that clients see me, they see the slides that I'm presenting, but they don't see each other. They don't see each other's names, anything of that nature. They just sort of enter and see me. So it's very different than an online Zoom group, which Karen will be talking about. So it's a lot more private and a little bit less, or I should say a lot less interactive. So I'll just share a little bit about the webinars I've been offering. The meditation webinar, we've been having about 15 to 20 people each week since almost last May. It's been going on, and it just has a brief amount of psychoeducation about a particular theme. So that might be on some coping strategies, self-compassion, things of that nature, and then a 10 to 15 minute guided meditation practice. It's just a 30-minute open group, meaning participants can come as they wish. And then the trauma-informed yoga webinar is a closed group. It's 12 weeks. It's an hour of psychoeducation on kind of grounding and understanding the body's nervous system and using somatic self-regulation strategies, and then a 45-minute or so guided yoga meditation, yoga practice. Next slide, please. So this is a very unique kind of format in that it provides different dynamics of confidentiality and safety. So for a lot of people, there's a greater sense of confidentiality and anonymity for folks because they can participate in the webinar without sharing anything about themselves to other people in the group. They also don't have to come on screen or show their face, which I think for a lot of people can be quite difficult. So that's one piece of it. Clients are still asked to sign or consent to our service agreement prior to participating in the webinar, which also outlines our limits of confidentiality. I also provide crisis resources at the beginning of each webinar, including, for example, the Assaulted Women's Helpline, as well as some walk-in counseling resources, because this is unfortunately not an arena to receive individualized support. It's really sort of information-based or yoga-based or meditation-based. And thus far, knock on wood, I haven't had any crises in the context of the webinars. There is an opportunity for folks to write in the Q&A to me privately. So thus far, it's been question-based and not any crises. So hopefully that kind of remains. Next slide, please. Thank you. So participation is not a central aspect of this webinar. There are a few opportunities for engagement, including polls. I try to do that each week. Q&A for folks to ask me questions about the material each day. And sometimes brainstorming. So collectively, I'll ask a question and I'll kind of type the answer. So like, what's keeping you sane during COVID or something to that effect? And then I'll sort of type people's responses, just so there's a little bit level of engagement and connection. Next slide, please. So pros and cons of the webinar format. Pros are, it's very low barrier for a lot of people because they don't need to come and sort of visually come into the space. We also have been able to provide a lot of service to a large number of clients at a time. I think the first yoga webinar, we had like 50 people register. Not all of those people came, but definitely very high numbers of registration that wouldn't be possible in a group. And we've also been able to include not only VAW clients. So for anyone who's experienced trauma has been, for example, the yoga webinar, that's been who I've offered it to, because it doesn't have to just be a certain population because no one can see each other. So it's been a little bit nice that way. There's a psychoeducational focus, which is beneficial for some folks. And there's a little bit lower stress on the facilitator. So navigating an online format and group dynamic, it's definitely less stressful than having a group, at least for me. I know we're all different, but I think that there's a little bit less to manage in a group dynamic wise. Cons, of course, lack of social connection from each other, lack of body language, knowing where people are at on the other side of the screen, we just don't know. Lack of certainty regarding fit, lack of, I don't know who's if it's necessarily the most appropriate group for folks or webinar for folks. Of course, less participation, and I can't provide kind of individualized support. I think that's it. I'm going to be really quick because I think I'm moving. I know Karen has a lot to say. A few things that I found really useful. PowerPoints are essential. I need to have some visual cues for folks. The consistency of the weekly format, psychoeducational focus, so not too much processing, anything like that. Some guided activities, so mapping personal coping strategies so people can do a little bit of self-reflection on their own on the other side of the screen. And some participation is helpful in allowing people to feel connected. Yeah, okay, next slide, please. I think that's it for me.
Great. Thanks, Claire. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be speaking about running VAW groups and I think just groups in general remotely. So you can go to the next slide. And I will say a caveat to this presentation, I have not provided groups remotely, but I gathered this information from counselors at FST who have. So to start, I think I'm going to frame this first part of the presentation around thinking through safety, confidentiality, crisis in group work, virtually or remotely. And I think the most important part that counselors have found for running successful groups virtually would be the group setup process. So thinking through things like, what are we going to be discussing as a group? What's the level of vulnerability I'm going to ask of the people who are going to participate in this group? And we've chosen to focus on skills-based groups and also peer support groups because we've found those feel like an appropriate level of vulnerability for people to be in the remote or virtual space. Another thing to think about would be the number of participants. We really started small with groups with like 6 people. Some facilitators now feel comfortable with 10 to 12 participants, but starting small seems to be helpful in this process. Another really important piece is just the documentation process. So making sure that the organization has like a service agreement document that reflects virtual work and kind of the parameters around that. And then another thing that we have done is we have a centralized intake process. So when people call, and specifically when they wanted to register for our VAW group that we ran, that was a closed group, we asked questions around, 1, do you have access to a camera? We required anyone participating in the group for the safety of other participants to have access to a camera, which I recognize also does present a barrier because not everyone has access to technology, but we just wanted to make that choice because of the safety of all participants. And then also after that happened, if someone had access to a camera and also had access to a safe, private, confidential space to participate in the group, then they would be set up to have a conversation with our group facilitator. And so that would be an initial conversation where the same questions would be asked just in case the person's circumstances have changed, but also having a more intensive conversation around what the group is going to look like, because we've found one of the big pieces of feedback we got from people is they really appreciated preparation ahead of the group, understanding what they were going to be walking into in the virtual group. So going over topics that would be discussed, kind of a general sense of group structure. And then also, again, checking in on safety and making sure people were in a place where they could participate safely in the group. So then once that happened, then we moved to the actual group itself. We have chosen to have 2 facilitators in groups. We find that's really helpful for managing when issues arise, which they definitely do in the virtual space. So one facilitator can attend to the entire group, and then if someone's having a technology issue, or if there happens to be, a crisis that does arise, the other facilitator can help address that. As I said, we have required video of participants for the VAW groups we run. There are other peer support groups and other programs where that's not the case, but in our VAW group, we did ask participants to be on video. Another really important piece of group facilitation is just ensuring that facilitators have access to participants' phone numbers and their addresses, because if there is a crisis, you want to know where, for example, if you need to call emergency services, where they need to go to be with a client. So that's one thing we've asked facilitators to have as well. Something we also chose to do was to shut off the private Zoom chat option, so participants can't send messages to each other. And this is just, again, thinking about the safety of participants and wanting to make sure the facilitator is aware of interactions happening between people. So we have our settings, we use Zoom, and our setting on Zoom is just that participants can message the facilitators. And then the last piece, which I think is really the most important, is normalizing interruptions, that interruptions are going to happen in the virtual space, and having a plan for them. So taking a lot of time at the beginning of the group to kind of set that up. So an example of this would be, 1, if someone in a group, if we see that someone has walked in their space in the background, what do we do and what is the expected response in the group? What we decided for one of our groups is the person who's in the room where someone's walked in would shut their laptop or whatever they're using off so that we could no longer see in their space, and we wait until they came back on video to continue with the group. And that did happen in a group, and because the group had that process set up already, everyone was able to process it after and feel comfortable with the response. Another thing we thought about that might sound a little silly, but is if someone has to go to the bathroom, what does that look like in the virtual world? Because what happened in one of our groups is someone shut off their camera, and then it kind of, other people got nervous about what happened with them. And so just kind of having an established process, it could be that you schedule that time, or you just, you figure it out as a group what makes sense to everyone. But I think really taking the time in the beginning to set up those processes and those protocols when there are interruptions that will happen is really important. And then the last piece we found to be really important and is to allow facilitators or for facilitators to have time after group to debrief with clients if that or participants if that feels necessary. And we have had that happen where it seems like there might have been something that happened in the group where the facilitator wants to outreach to individual participants. You can go to the next slide. And then I'm going to talk about just briefly 5 key learnings we feel like we've come away with all of our group work that we've done. One, as I mentioned, planning ahead is super important, and also preparing participants ahead of time is really important so they understand what they're going to get into. We found that helps increase the number of people that register that actually attend the group. 2, we found that it's really important for facilitators to feel comfortable with the technology that they're using because they are going to have to help support participants. And then also if there is space and capacity before groups to provide tech support to participants, that has been really helpful as well. 3, technology issues, there will be interruptions, issues will arise, so just normalizing that. And like I mentioned, having plans and processes in place for when that happens as a group, like having the group set that up. 4, we found that things move a little slower in the virtual space because of there's so much going on, there's so much interruption that can happen. So you can plan for a lot, but no, you might not get everything done in that group session that you were planning on, and that's okay. And then you can go to the next slide. And then, as I mentioned, we have chosen to focus our group work on skills-based groups and peer support groups, just really being mindful of the level of vulnerability and people's kind of window of tolerance in the virtual space. So yeah, and I'm happy to answer any questions. That's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much to both of you. And I feel wretched for the way I organized this webinar because I feel like all the speakers are under such pressure. So thank you for speaking to that really important group work. And again, if people have questions, you can put them into the chat box. We're going to go to our final presenters, and they'll be discussing the adaptations from in-person group programming for children and youth to online groups. So the first speaker will be, well, I'm not sure actually about the order, but Karen Blake has been working with the VAW sector for 25 plus years. Karen currently has been working at Yorktown for 17 years, supervising Here to Help, a group for women who have left an abusive relationship and children exposed to violence. She also supervises Mindful Fathering, a group for perpetrators of woman abuse. Glenda Diaz has a BASc in Family and Community Social Services, diplomas in AWCCA and CYW. She's worked with the Here to Help program for 15 years at several agencies, Yorktown Family Services, Child Development Institute, and Jewish Family and Child Service. In the spring of 2020, she was the lead of the staff team in her Here to Help group at Yorktown, and she co-developed the virtual curriculum called Here to Help Family Connection Program. This curriculum is currently being offered virtually at several agencies. Glenda and Karen.
Thank you, Joanne. Just to give you some history, Here to Help's been delivered across the city of Toronto for 20 years, hosted by 6 organizations, including a Child Development Institute, YWCA, La Maison, Jewish Family and Child, Native Child and Family, and Yorktown Family Services. In person, we would deliver 3 children's groups, a youth group, and a mother's group that would run simultaneously. We'd offer dinner, we'd have a family interactive time, and then we would have small group work, dividing the children according to their ages, stages of development. We'd also offer interpreters. Due to the pandemic, we had to think outside the box. We had to modify our curriculum, but we also had to take into all of those considerations, safety, timing, what to do, how many groups can we have at one time. And so in April in 2020, Yorktown Family Services delivered the first Here to Help group virtually. We developed the Here to Help Family Connections, a group that is trauma-informed, focusing on parent-child relationships for children and youth exposed to gender-based violence, a group where families can explore their feelings, learn mindfulness techniques, and share their experiences, hence lessening the feelings of isolation. We are currently delivering 5 series. We've currently delivered 5 series of Here to Help Family Connections. And this morning, Glenda, whom has been instrumental in supporting the development of this curriculum, will share how we engage families and strategies that we utilize to support group facilitators. So now I'm going to pass it on to Glenda.
Thanks, Karen. Next slide, please. So one of the things, a lot of the things that Karen Crow spoke about, we take into consideration as well, like how many families are in the group, what our group norms are. So we try really hard to work in collaboration with families. We look at their strengths and their needs. We meet beforehand with them, and we find to be able to engage the children, especially the teen, having somebody else support moms with technology really helps to buy them into the group, because usually they don't like to be the ones to have to help mom figure out the technology. So we found that that has been helpful, because then they get to just come and be part of the group and not have to be the tech support in the family. Then in the next couple of slides, we'll also show you that we send out family kits to families. So when we're doing activities, when we're facilitating those activities together, the families all have the same materials. And we have found, we've changed it a little bit depending on the ages of the children. And we've also learned we sometimes make mine jars. At the beginning, we sent glass jars until a couple of them fell and broke. So now we've learned, we've adapted, and we send now plastic jars. We also do a lot of visual and active activities. So we'll show that in the next couple of slides. Next slide, please. So I don't know, Karen, if you want to talk a little bit about the family kits.
Sure. So we sent a kit of supplies over to our families prior to starting group. It's usually, actually it's the second week of group, because we want to ensure attendance, commitment to the group. We tailor the kits to the actual ages, stages, and development of the children. And so if we have quite a few youth in the group, we're obviously going to change up some of the art materials we send out. And like all the materials that you see here are what the families receive, in addition to if they have younger children. Here to Help, it's 4 to 18 years of age. We usually only go to 16, because often 18-year-olds, 17, 18-year-olds aren't that interested in attending this kind of program, but sometimes they are. And so we also provide handouts. Sometimes we also, if we can, provide in different languages.
Next slide, please. So this is one of our welcome screens that we use. So what we do on Tuesday nights at Yorktown is our group runs from 6:30 to 7:30. We invite families to start logging in at 6:15. And during the 6:15 to 6:30 time, it helps us to help with any technology issues. But we also have questions that they can engage in during that time, so that it isn't just waiting time. So usually we like to have a lot of open-ended questions. With the older kids, we use some of the riddles. With the young ones, because we try to group our families depending on the ages of their kids, so that other kids are interacting with children the same age. We sometimes will use questions. I think some of the ones that we've done is, would you rather be a narwhal or would you rather be a unicorn? And then we'll put the pictures up. Next slide. We also do some of the active-based activities that we do is this or that. So this or that videos, they're actually pretty popular on YouTube. So they'll show a screen and it'll say, if you like pizza, do this exercise. If you like pasta, do this exercise. But we find that sometimes those videos go really, really fast. So we've just created our own, and then we'll add different activities to the whatever this or that is. Next slide, please. We also sometimes, depending on the week, so for our feelings weeks, this is how we start the conversation. So once we've started the group, it's, would you rather be a thumbs up or a high five emoji? And then things like, when's the last time you laughed really, really hard and what happened to make you do so? And then we try to have really thought-provoking questions in there. It's like, how do you feel about cleaning your room? And this sometimes brings up different feelings. And then we talk about what feelings that could bring up for mom and what feelings that brings up for children. And, you know, we've already established group norms where we are very respectful to everybody that's attending group. And so we talk about what feelings come up with regards to the questions that we have. Next slide, please. So again, and I think previous presenters have talked about this in our intake process. We have consent forms. We talk about expectations of cameras and microphones, and it's the same thing. We ask families to leave their cameras on with regards to safety. We also talk about sometimes teens don't want to be on screen. So we really allow for that to happen. We just ask that they sometimes stick their hand in and give us a thumbs up or a thumbs down if they like or don't like what is happening. But we do ask for cameras to be on for safety. We do lock our meetings as well. We also introduce breakout rooms. So if a family is having a really hard time, we beforehand preset who's going to be going into a breakout room with a family if it is needed. Next slide. And again, we also manage distractions by establishing group norms. We really try to operate from everyone's thoughts and feelings are important. So we want to hear them. So we want to know what people are thinking and saying. So we say, unmute yourself when you're ready to share. We allow for distractions because each household is different. I think this series, we have a range of ages. We have families that have children from 2 to 16. So we are aware of that and distractions will happen and we have to adapt. We also try to be aware of what is happening for kids during the day. We know that children have gone back and forth to school. For children that have chosen to do in-person schooling, we noticed the week after they went back to school, they were extra tired. And then there was a lot of feelings coming up and kids, it didn't really seem like kids really wanted to engage. So we just stopped the topic and we talked about what does it feel like to have something change that you have no power over? Because really they don't have any control over that change. So we talk about what does it feel like to have all of a sudden adults around you decide you're going back to school and now you're learning from home and now you're back at school. So we talk about what has worked for them. It's hard, those feelings are hard, and what can they do to help manage those changes? Next slide, please. So some of the active activities that we have on hand is we do scavenger hunts. And for the scavenger hunts, we also say, if you can't find this in your home, tell us about it. For example, find something that is red. If they can't find something that is red in their home, tell us about something that you like that is red or that you own that is red. Because we also have some families that are living in shelters. So we like to adapt our activities as much as we can. And the 5 senses scavenger hunt is really great as well, because they can talk about what's something that smells bad. They don't necessarily have to find it. Next slide. So these are also some of the PowerPoint slides that we have ready for active activities. So we find having the words, having us read it out loud, and having the visual does help moms and children. So these they like to do. It's like you curl your toes up like you're trying to pick up a pencil with your feet. Next slide, please. And then I have a few more. This one is the kids get a laugh out of this one. It's like suck in your stomach as if you're trying to slide through this narrow opening. Next slide. And then making fists and pretending to squeeze the juice out of an orange. Next slide. This one, it's pretend that a bug landed on your nose and you're trying to get it off of your face. You can't use your hands and you can't shake your head. So you need to get that bug off of your nose. So it's just a fun activity. And we really, really encourage moms to also take part, and all of the facilitators also take part. So it isn't, you're not the only one on the screen trying to get this bug off your nose. Next slide. And one of the things that we find helpful is we still meet. So we meet before group to plan. So we'll meet on another evening. We plan who's going to do what. So if you look at our agenda here, there are names beside. And I usually have this screen right beside the facilitation screen so that it helps you. Some people like to have the paper agenda in front of them, but I find it's helpful so that you're not looking down. You're kind of always looking at the camera and it doesn't look like you're disengaging. We also have a backup plan. If something goes wrong, who is going to take over that activity? Next slide. Some barriers and lessons learned. Again, being mindful of what platform you're using, the device, the capability of the device, the chat functions, being able to change names. So we've learned a lot we look up on YouTube how different platforms work so that we can then support moms. And it's helpful. A platform looks very different sometimes on a phone than on a laptop. So being able to tell moms, this is where you go to do this on a phone, tablet, or a computer is very helpful. And we've learned that we always have 3 or 5 extra movement activities if we're seeing children are just not able to engage in the topic for that night for whatever reason. We will sometimes do an activity where it looks like everybody needs a break. So we play what's called pass the movement. So we'll ask them, think of a TikTok movement that you've learned in the last week, or think of any active movement, and we're going to get you to lead it. So the facilitators, my movement will be clapping. So I'll get everybody to help me clapping, and then I'm going to pass it on to Karen. And then this helps us to learn names and to have them be leaders. And they can always pass if they choose to. We sometimes will do a lot of grounding exercises. We do what's called tree yoga. So we pretend to be trees. We stand really tall. We have roots that are really strong and they're into the ground. And then we talk about afterwards, we debrief with the families. And we've had children just really get into this and tell us that they are birch trees because they are very old and they're very unique. So that's always super helpful. Next slide. And then more tips and tricks is, like I had said earlier, having the agenda beside the platform window, practicing sharing your screen. Like, I know it seems simple, but sometimes depending on Mac users versus Windows users, it'll look different. So as a team, we always practice, and then we get a couple people different people to practice, because usually sometimes on the night of group, if there's tech issues, somebody else also knows how to do it. For us, what works is we have several facilitators. On average, we have 2 to 4 facilitators that are on hand, just because we have so many families that have different needs, and we try to know facilitator strengths and their space. So if I know I'm more comfortable with doing a grounding technique that has a script, or I know my colleague is in her living room and can actually push her device back and really show us some yoga movements, that is always helpful to know who can do what. And we always have a plan and a backup plan, and we continue. Even though we've been doing 5 series now, we practice always. Next slide. And those are all. I know we went through everything really quickly. Feel free to reach out to Karen or myself if you have any questions, or if you want to know a little bit more about what we do. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much, Karen and Glenda. Some fabulous ideas and some fabulous information. We had a question in the chat box, and one of them was, are you finding there needs to be less clients in a virtual group? That has been our experience. So I'm going to ask Karen and Glenda about that. And then, because Luciana also offers group programs, she can go next and give us her experience at Abrigo.
I can start, and Glenda, please jump in. We absolutely have less families. We run more groups on one evening. We usually do 5 to 7 families. 5 is really great, but we also have to take into consideration how many children are in each family. And Glenda does an amazing job at grouping and ensuring that each group, first of all, depending on the ages of the children, we want to put the ages of the children together as much as we can, and also no more than 5 to 7 families at the most. Anything else, Glenda?
We also take, because we've run a couple sessions with interpreters, so we take the interpretation into account. So if we have a family that needs interpretation, we'll put them in a smaller group as well.
Thank you. And am I correct, Luciana, that you also do some group work?
Yes. So at Abrego, we have groups with seniors, and with the seniors, as I said, we did have a lot of tech challenges at the beginning, but now we had, if I'm not wrong, 85 seniors that are connecting virtually. So of course they had to break out like in different groups. So we are offering 3 groups a week. We also have groups for moms and dads. And we are keeping, I believe, the number between like 9 to 14 participants in a way that we can still connect with all of them. We also have a partnership with a group therapy at the Toronto Western Hospital, and I am one of the facilitators of the group therapy. And there we are also keeping the number like between 9 to 12 participants. That's what we have been doing, yeah, as a regular practice.
Thank you. I have a question for Luciana while you're on the hot seat. You talked about your seniors groups, and you talked about how they're getting peer support and some family member support to access the technology. So my question is a little bit funny because it takes us back to ethics and safety. How do you get family support on technology when the safety in the family may be a consideration? How do you make that assessment? If the question makes sense.
Yeah, of course. As I was saying, like with the seniors, we are not just like talking about clients that were exposed to domestic violence, right? We might have clients that were exposed, but it's like we do have more like the program as a way of keeping them connected and with the community. In the hospital as well, I saw a lot of family support helping the family members to learn the techniques. With the VAW clients, and then I would be speaking mostly about the clients I connect individually through the virtual platform. I've seen like the kids helping mom, or, you know, like teaching them some skills. And as I said, I've been also helping the clients by the phone, you know, like just step by step, and also normalizing their fear, normalizing their struggles, because we've been through the same. Right, as I said in my presentation, I think the challenges were not from our client side. We as professionals were dealing with the same struggles. We were also learning. We were also crawling like babies in this new virtual reality, right? So I think that being able to normalize the frustrations and also modeling our clients in this frustration tolerance was very helpful through the process.
Thank you so much. That's really helpful. The seniors group, I might have missed that in the presentation. So it was a broader group of seniors, and that makes a lot of sense. I have a question for, I think it was Claire who spoke to the psychoeducational groups. And did you offer these groups in person prior to COVID, or was this a COVID kind of initiated endeavor?
It was primarily a COVID initiated endeavor. I've definitely run a lot of groups in person before, and they a lot of the time included a psychoeducational component, but not as a kind of exclusive format.
Thank you. And my next question to you is, how do you, like, seriously, this is a serious question. How do you do yoga? Like, how do you actually make yoga work virtually?
Yeah, I set up my space so that the camera can reach my whole body. I stand at the back of my space and speak loudly. And it's kind of like doing a YouTube video. Yeah, it's kind of like that kind of setup. But yeah, I just have to stand really far away, if that makes sense.
That makes sense, I guess, to people who've done it, and it's a little bit hard to imagine how that works so seamlessly if you've never done it, I'm sure. But great to know that it is possible. I think that's really interesting and really good information to know that you can do full body kind of activities on Zoom or on video. Question for Karen Crow. You talked about the process for one of the counseling groups being that you had a process for if people needed to turn off their cameras, and for understanding and for safety purposes, you would identify that people let you know if they were going to turn off their cameras so other group members wouldn't be alarmed. Are there other group norms that have come up for the groups that you've found beyond just the turning off the cameras, things that the group have set up that are specific to virtual life?
Yeah, I can answer this, and then I know other people might be running groups, so feel free to jump in. One other norm that definitely has been important, I think, I think also happens in groups that are not virtual, but it's just like how communication and sharing happens during group and making sure everyone's clear on that. I think one thing I mentioned also is just, when there are interruptions, what happens. So like what I mentioned, where if someone walks in the room, one of the groups was not comfortable with having anyone else like see them on the participant's camera. So asking that person to shut off their camera and like close their laptop when someone enters their space. That was another norm that came up. And yeah, those are the ones that are jumping to my mind. Does anyone else have any like group norms that have presented themselves?
I can add some. When I was facilitating groups with fathers, we had to discuss, for example, about not driving or, being in a place where they were actually safe to engage in the virtual setting, or even about not using any substance while we were in a meeting. I also had issues, for example, and it brought some discussions, folks that were laying on the bed while, connecting, or even not properly dressed for a meeting. So there were some like very particular discussions that suddenly we had to have in our virtual groups that we would not have in the past, right? When I think about the in-person session.
Thank you for that, Luciana. That made me think of one other thing that did come up is people being mindful of what's in their background. So like if they have pictures on their wall, that kind of thing. So asking people if they can to have a neutral background, or if they want to put up like a background from Zoom or something like that, doing that. But just because things on people's walls could be triggering to other people in the group.
Yeah, and I also remember like a few times where clients forgot to mute themselves, and when we were having a break, and suddenly we were listening to what was going on, and there was one situation that I actually had to call the home phone, just to say, hey, we can listen to you, please mute yourself. And yeah, so that was another also challenge that we had.
Great. And Karen and Glenda, any additional norms that have come up for your groups?
I think for us in our consent form, we talked to moms about being in a room, in a private room where nobody else has access to hearing other family stories. Because when we run our group in person, it is a closed group and it is just moms and children. So we are mindful of just making sure that they're respecting their confidentiality and also other families. Because we did, I think the very first time we ran group, this was not something we had discussed, and one mom decided to join while she was at a birthday party. So that was learning for us. We're like, okay, we need to make it clear that they need to be somewhere private where nobody else is listening to other family stories.
And in addition, if the mom is, let's say, she doesn't have access to the children that evening, that it's not okay for the children to join through another home with someone else listening in. And so we've learned all of these things throughout the 5, groups that we've delivered, and we're always learning more. But what Glenda said about orientation intake is really important, that the families understand what are the group norms, especially for virtual.
Thank you all. I think those lessons learned are really important, and it's really helpful to hear the lessons learned from you on this webinar as opposed to learning by trial and error. And of course, everyone's going to come up with their own challenges, but I think it's really helpful to hear your challenges and they can be proactive as opposed to have someone dressed inappropriately your first go around virtual group. I have a question for all of you, and I realize we only have a couple of minutes left. Because your numbers may be less, how have you negotiated this with funding to serve fewer people? So service targets, I guess I'm speaking about.
I can talk about Yorktown in Here to Help. Our numbers are pretty close to what they were before. What we're doing differently is we're having moms and children and youth together, so we can have 3 or 4 groups in one evening. We can use Breakout, but we also have 2 WebEx accounts, and so we can run multiple groups in one evening. So right now we've actually delivered groups throughout the summer. Last year especially, there was such a need and so much stress with the pandemic that we had so many referrals that we decided to go right through the summer. We didn't really take a break, maybe a week or 2 in between series. And so we're actually over our target number right now, but you know, we're still continuing. And I think, yeah, so that for us, I'm not sure about other organizations.
So we've got 1 minute left. I'm going to pass it to Family Service Toronto, because I think you had mentioned your numbers were a bit lower. So I don't know if Karen or Claire want to address that.
Yeah, I can start, and Claire, feel free to jump in. I think, so the webinar format that Claire has been using actually has a much larger number than we would be able to have in a virtual group. So I think it's kind of balanced between the webinars that we're offering and then offering virtual groups has helped kind of balance out numbers. So I don't think we've also seen a decrease in service targets overall, which is great. And we're also offering maybe more groups, I think less frequent, like shorter, like time limited groups, and offering more of them, which has helped with that as well.
Okay, so I'm going to stop there. We're at 11 o'clock. I want to send out a huge thank you to our 5 presenters for sharing their experiences with us. They've given their time out of their busy schedules to prepare for and present at today's webinar. So I know that I join everyone in thanking you. I also want to thank Women Act for their support to make this webinar possible. In the chat box, you'll find the slides from today's presentation and a link to a brief evaluation. I know that you are sick of doing surveys, but if you can please help us by doing this evaluation survey, it really helps us to improve future webinars, and it actually helps us secure funding to show that these webinars are valuable and that they're helpful for people's work. In the coming days, I'll send you an email, and that will have a reminder to complete the evaluation and information about when the recording will be available. So thank you all for attending, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks again.